Thank you very much. This will start the session 1, part 2, Breakout Group 1, Advanced Solution for Transition. This is a jointly organized with CBD office as well as their international conference Sustainability Science. Actually, this is 8 ICSS. My name is Kensuke Fukushi. I'm the professor at the Institute for Future Initiatives at University of Tokyo. This session is organized with various organizations, as you see in the bottom of the slide. The theme of this session is going to be detailedly explained by Dr. Saito in the next speaker. However, this session is one of the results of the several years of study on the scenario and model study on the biodiversity, especially toward achievement of the net zero biodiversity loss. This is one of the main themes of the IPBES assessment, and especially the new conceptual framework of that biodiversity scenario called the Natural Future Framework, NFF. Through this session, the speakers and participants will discuss how the NFF can be operationalized, especially in the local context, as well as the Global Biodiversity Framework. And of course, we cannot forget about the Sustainable Development Goal, and this action is going to contribute under the achievement of the SDGs. We have only 55 minutes, and we have 4 speakers. It is very challenging. We have to fight this time. We have a first speaker, Dr. Osamu Saito, with the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, senior scientist. And second speaker is Dr. Lola Pereira. She's a Stellenbosch University faculty member, as well as Stockholm Resilience Center and Nature Future Framework. And we are going to welcome Dr. Haga from Osaka University. He's also one of the very important researchers in our project team. And lastly, but not least, Dr. Herlin Chien. She's a faculty member of National Pingdong University of Science and Technology. She's going to talk about urban river restoration. And I'm very happy to invite Professor Kazuhiko Takeuchi, who is a professor at the IFI University of Tokyo, as well as the president of IPBES, with their 2 main organizers of this session, giving a response for selected or each speech. We tried to accommodate the question that was raised in the Q&A box at the last of this session. However, if we cannot take all the questions, which I think I expected, we will try our best to answer through in writing or later of this session. So without delay, I'd like to invite Dr. Saito as a first speaker. Dr. Saito, floor is yours.
So as you know, the IPBES already published this scenario and models methodological assessment report on the scenario and the models on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So this is especially focusing on the biodiversity and ecosystem service models and scenarios. And here the models are defined as a quantitative and quantitative description of the key components of the systems and of the relationship between those components. And the scenarios are representation of the possible future of one or more components of the system. And then this assessment was also provide this the important diagram which capture the different dimension of the scenario. Scenario can be used for agenda setting and also the design of the policy, but also it can be used for the policy screening and also the retrospective evaluation of the policy. And here in this session, we invited a couple of the one case study from Japan, especially on the expected in Japan. And also that we invited one case study from Taiwan, which more or less kind of reviewing retrospective policy evaluation, focusing on the river restoration. So you can hear the couple of different type of the scenario exercise including the IPBES, the new scenario framework. Also, myself and also the Dr. Haga and Professor Takeuchi is leading the project on the scenario and the models in Japan for the last 5 years. And this project is actually completed last month. And this focuses on develop the integrated assessment model of socio-ecological systems to project and assess natural and ecosystem values of the natural capital and ecosystem services under the different future scenarios. So we worked on the terrestrial ecosystem service assessment and also the marine ecosystem assessment and both interactions under the different future scenarios. And we also investigated the socio-economic values. So not only the amount of changes of the terrestrial ecosystem economic values. And then they also discuss how we can transform the governance systems at the multiple scale. So this is the diagram which summarizes the overall structure of the integrated model we developed. So first we developed 4 different scenarios, national levels, and depending on these narratives of the 4 scenarios, we developed the demographic sub-model and also land use change model. And this demographic change and land use change provide the baseline information to estimate different ecosystem services in both terrestrial and marine ecosystem. And so these are some of the examples of the different ecosystem services considered in our assessment and prediction. And also interaction between the terrestrial ecosystem services and marine ecosystem services are also assessed. And it's also assessed in terms of the socio-economic values and also including inclusive well-being. In Japan, as you may know, we identify 2 important axes to generate 4 different scenarios. One is the natural capital base, utilizing more natural capital versus depending on the exports, like depending on the produced capital. And the other axis is urbanization, more compactification or urbanization versus the localization or dispersed population. So using these 2 axes, we generate 4 different scenarios: natural capital base, compact society, and the extreme one, the produced capital base dispersed society. And then by using these 4 scenarios, we also quantify the ecosystem services changes in overall Japan and also the 3 different locations in Japan: Hokkaido, Sado, Noto, and also Okinawa. So we also worked on the 3 different case study sites with much higher spatial resolution. And then we also emphasize the importance of the science policy interface and society interface. So we also collaborate with the local stakeholders to develop scenarios. At the same time, in the middle of our project, or PANCES project, 5-year project, we also had some opportunity to collaborate with the IPBES Nature Future Framework, which will be explained by the next speaker, Dr. Laura Pereira. So I will not go into detail, but this is a very interesting and also useful the framework which which can help developing a new future the scenarios, especially for the biodiversity and ecosystem services. So that's why we select this is one of the key element of these sessions. But this session is not, official kind of the work by the IPBES. It is more like, introduce so far, and then try to also introduce some of the relating works done by in Japan and Taiwan. And then last year, almost 1 year ago, we organized a joint workshop with IPBES to share our PANCES project outcomes and the IPBES Nature Future Framework, how we can translate this Nature Future Framework for the local context, including Japan's case. And this is almost the last slide, slide for me. So I think the perennially already mentioned repeatedly about the importance of the transformative change. And this, the diagram was also included in the IPBES global assessment, which highlight the importance of the lever and the leverage point to change the indirect drivers. So we have been working on the direct driver of the biodiversity change, but it's not sufficient to transform society for the sustainable world in the nature of society. So these are already included and emphasized in the IPBES global assessment. So I just would like to recapture those the concept. And then also the previous, the last speaker of the plenary already explained extensively about this post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, so I will not go into detail. So can contribute, not all, but some part of this biodiversity, the framework and these 20 goals. And then this is my last slide. I would like to propose some of the key points for discussion. So the scenario and model can play the powerful role of designing solutions for the transformative change through holistic and transdisciplinary approach. And we need to develop a kind of integrated scenario model which can capture different body systems, including local, indigenous local knowledge. But we also face some challenges like a mismatch or misfit of spatial scale bodies, institutions, and supply-demand gaps, which will be also touched upon by the case study in Taiwan. And then the last three, the harmonize and maximize various effort and solution for biodiversity, climate, and sustainable production and consumption will be also the important agenda to discuss after the three following presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Saito. Thank you for the very important.
So I stopped the screen sharing, and then the Professor Fukushi, can you introduce?
Okay, I will go to the suggest to go to the second speaker. Thank you, Dr. Saito, for introduction and framework talk. And the second speaker is, as I explained to you, Dr. Lola Pereira from Stellenbosch University on the Nature Future Framework. Please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some people. Great to have you all here. And my name's Laura Pereira. I'm a member of the IPBES task force on scenarios and models. And what I was going to do at the presentation today is just give a very general overview of the work in progress that we as a task force are doing with regards to developing the Nature Futures Framework. So the general outline of the talk will really just be an introduction to the framework, starting from why IPBES actually needs new scenarios. Then looking at the process of how we actually developed the Nature Futures Framework, and then just give a very brief example of sort of how we're thinking of operationalizing the Nature Futures Framework with reference to some illustrative examples. And I would just like to really give all credit to the entire task force for their contribution to this process and these slides. I'm just here presenting what a much larger group has been involved in. So as Professor Saito already mentioned, why do we even need new scenarios in the first instance? So as Professor Saito already mentioned, in 2016, there was a methodological assessment that IPBES produced on scenarios and models for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And in essence, sort of some of the main findings there is that most global scenarios were limited to assessing the impact of drivers on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So they didn't actually have nature at the center. Very few actually talk about sort of this idea of desirable futures, or where we actually want to go in terms of future trajectories for people and nature. And they're actually developed largely for other purposes, mainly for climate change, actually looking at the social the shared socioeconomic pathways, for example. They lack a participatory approach. Obviously, that's very difficult to achieve at the global level, but the need to sort of really involve people in a more transdisciplinary way in creating these scenarios was a bit of a gap. And that, it's really difficult to incorporate these ideas of transformative change or transformative responses and the associated implications of these interventions for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So these were some of the challenges that we set out to address in the process going forward. So then just referencing very quickly the 2019 Global Assessment report, which actually pointed out that sort of there's this really important finding that in order to bend the biodiversity curve, we actually need sort of multicultural options, and that these regional and global scenarios that they analyzed lacked an explicit consideration of the views, perspectives, and rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So sort of that diversity of perspectives was a really core aspect of what we were trying to set out to address in this new generation of scenarios. So I'm not going to go into sort of extreme detail in terms of the process that we underwent, but this is actually available in a paper in People and Nature that was published last year, which sort of talks a lot more explicitly about the different stakeholder engagement processes that we went through as an expert group in a task force, and sort of how the Nature Futures Framework was formalized. But you can see it sort of started in 2017 with the visioning workshop in Auckland, went through a variety of different iterations, sort of making connections to the IPBES plenary, engaging with the CBD COP in Sharm el Sheikh in 2019. In 2018, and then going into another workshop with modelers actually in Vancouver, Canada in 2019. And in essence, the main aspect that I wanted to emphasize with the group is that this 2017 sort of visioning process that we developed in Auckland really was trying to sort of get a participatory process going that engaged a diverse group of stakeholders from around the world, to really start thinking about what would a desirable future for nature actually look like. So if we were able to actually bend the biodiversity curve, or we were actually living in harmony with nature, if we were to achieve all of the targets that we set ourselves on the 2050 agenda, what would this world actually look like? Could we put some meat on the bones of the targets? And so the result of this process was a set of sort of 7 emergent visions of the future. And these actually, exactly as is sort of shown in this slide, actually mapped really well onto this triangular space that Professor Saito has already referenced, which we've called the Nature's Futures Framework. So you can see how there were different components of value perspectives that we called that actually mapped onto this sort of triangular heuristic device. So the next slide, please. And this is where I'm going to go into a lot more detail explaining the rationale behind the Nature Futures Framework, or the triangle, as we sometimes refer to it as. And in essence, we recognized that there were 3 important sort of value perspectives that people had for nature. The first was just what we've called nature for nature, which really emphasizes the intrinsic value of nature. It talks about allocating space for nature. There are a lot of sort of discussions in the literature at the moment, for example, the half Earth approach, which really focuses on the need to give nature space, sort of separate from humans in order to thrive. You then have the bottom right-hand corner, this idea of nature for society, which kind of focuses on nature's contributions to people, how it's really important for humans to be able to derive different contributions or ecosystem services from nature. So for example, the food that we grow in order to eat, or the fiber that we produce in order to have clothing or structures for housing. So that's the nature for society component, also sort of really desirable, sort of a need that we have. And then finally, there's the third corner, which is this nature as culture component, which sort of talks a lot more to many indigenous ways of thinking that don't actually see a division between nature and society, where actually we're fundamentally, nature is a part of culture and you can't actually differentiate people as separate from nature. This idea of living in harmony or people being one with nature kind of sits at the core of this idea. And so you can see within this triangular framework that the Nature Futures framework sort of can hold multiple sort of nature value perspectives at any one time, and that using this framework really opens up the kinds of values that we think are really important to include in scenarios about nature futures, but that also really appreciates a plurality of these different perspectives that are available at any one point. And so, for example, in one situation, you might find yourself tending towards a more nature for society idea when you're thinking about food production or those kinds of services. In another idea, you might sort of be edging more towards the blue part of the circle when you're thinking about culturally relevant species or the need to really preserve indigenous lands or to look at those kinds of relationships. And so it's really key that actually we're able to incorporate the entire space in the scenarios that we generate and in the models that we use. And so an important aspect to emphasize of the Nature Futures framework is that it actually really maps extremely well onto the IPBES concepts on values, which you can see a paper led by Anai Pascal in 2017, which talks to this idea of intrinsic values, of instrumental values, and of relational values. And so the Nature for Nature side talks, sort of incorporates this idea of intrinsic values. The Nature for Society component talks to these more instrumental or utilitarian values, and the Nature as Culture component sort of talks more to this emphasis on relational values, which are actually largely lacking within current scenarios. So this is a really big gap that we're trying to fill as a task force. So just coming back to the triangle, back to the framework. Just two ideas that I want to emphasize here is the first that the triangle, or at least the edges of the triangle, sort of are relative to each other. And so we're looking at sort of a bounded space where the extremes of the triangle are kind of like the outer edges of what we would define as desirable. And this is obviously a normative framework that requires a lot of work with a variety of stakeholders to be able to define. And we're working through that process at the moment. But that they're relative to each other. So, just because you're inching towards one particular corner, you'd probably be sort of moving slightly away from some of the others. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing, as long as you're sort of within the triangular space that we've defined as desirable. So this idea of the triangle being relative, and that the edges are kind of these extreme cutoff points in terms of what we think of as the desirable versus the non-desirable future. But that within that, there are multiple different iterations or ways of actually interpreting what these different values mean or what they look like for different societies around the world. And so plurality and diversity really sits at the heart of this framework to be able to operate across multiple different scales. And so quickly, just to say, operationalizing the Nature Futures framework, we sort of now developed the framework. We're going through a process of developing a set of toolbox to be able to implement this. This requires new modeling approaches. And I see all of my colleagues, Hejin is on the call and has been working really sort of steadily on looking at how you incorporate feedbacks, how you can look at different relationships between biodiversity, good quality of life, and sort of plurality across multiple scales. And then just to give you a little bit of meat on sort of what we mean by these triangles, my last slide is coming up next, my second to last slide, is this development of some illustrative examples that we're trying to sort of define what some of these corners could actually look like, particularly incorporating some transformative intervention. So actually starting with transformation as kind of the main focus point for the development of these scenarios. And so we've developed 6 different storylines that will hopefully be published relatively soon, that actually describe what one example of some of these stories could look like. This is definitely not a definitive idea, but it's an illustrative way of being able to operationalize the qualitative component of these narratives. And so the final slide, just to say the next steps that we're developing as a task force is to finalize these rich narratives, to really talk about the kinds of pathways or the specific interventions that we need to get there, looking at quantifying sort of drivers and responses and other kinds of important metrics, and then particularly just to look at the sort of a variety of metrics that can actually talk to all the different components of the triangle. So thank you very much for that. That's the end of the presentation. And thank you for being able to share the slides, Professor Saito.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Laura. We expected to have some comment from Professor Takeuchi.
Thank you very much. I would like to make a comment on the 2 presentations. One is on the Osamu's presentation. And one thing that we need to further consider is how we could consider how we could combine the net zero scenarios in climate change, as well as the net zero biodiversity loss. So these 2 things are separately discussed, but in the larger picture, we need to consider the integration of these 2 scenarios, particularly aiming to achieve net zero both in biodiversity and the climate change by 2050. This is one thing. And then the second issue is how we could localize the net zero scenarios, particularly the climate change as well as the biodiversity. Localization is very important. For example, net zero cities, net zero biodiversity cities, net zero biodiversity rural areas. These sort of things need to be further discussed. And also, it is very important to try to understand the linkage between the terrestrial ecosystem and coastal or marine ecosystems. And for example, we are now facing the serious issues of marine plastics. But when we try to solve the issues of marine plastics, we need to consider about the resource circulation, particularly of the plastics on the terrestrial ecosystems. So these are 2 different ecosystems, also previously discussed separately, but we need to consider about the linkage between the terrestrial and the coastal ecosystem. This is the 3rd point. And the 4th point is that how we could consider about the relationship between the natural capital and producer capital. Very recently, Sir Parsa Dasgupta make the report on assessing the values of natural capital, who previously proposed the concept of inclusive wealth. And we are developing, based on his idea, how we could further develop the inclusive well-being. So this is another aspect, that how we could really assess the value of natural capital in our society. And 5th is that many people are saying that these 10 years are quite important years. Either the global community move toward a sustainable society, or we fail in achieving the sustainable society. And this is exactly the same period that we need to think about the post-COVID-19 recovery. And many countries, including the countries in the EU, or even in Japan, or recently in the US, is trying to develop the concept of the green recovery. How we could develop the green recovery concept with the issues of tackling of the net zero biodiversity loss, or as well as the net zero emissions, will be very crucial. And many financial investment has been decided by the government of many countries, and we need to fully utilize this post-COVID recovery with the establishment of sustainable society in order to promote the transformative change, which we discussed, but we could not unfortunately realize the transformative change. And then with Laura's explanation about the importance of nature future framework, I fully understand her way of understanding through transdisciplinary approach and need to invite the diverse stakeholders and based on the multiple values and including the cultural values and difference of the societies and appreciation of indigenous knowledges. So previously, many people are trying to understand a very simple way of how we could move forward, but the issue is very complicated, and we need to consider the plural way of understanding the issues and try to develop the future scenarios based on the multiple participation of different stakeholders. And it is very important how we could get the consensus of drawing the complex narratives for discussing of our futures. This will be extremely important, and very much appreciate these two presentations, and I hope that we could further develop our ideas throughout this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Takeuchi. I'd like to invite third speaker, who is Dr. Chihiro Haga from Osaka University. He's going to talk about PANCES scenario case study in Japan. Floor is yours, Professor Haga.
Okay, I'm Chihiro Haga from Osaka University, Japan. I'm very glad to have the opportunity. So I'm here today to talk about the case study of scenario analysis in Japan. Many scenario analysis of ecosystem services are focused on the overuse of nature, but our situation is slightly different. We are also facing the situation of underuse of nature. So why we are concerned about underuse of nature? That is because population is declining and aging rate is increasing towards 2050. Official future population estimation showed that about 30% of population will be disappeared and residential area will be shrink. Yellow grids in the right figure indicates the population will be 0 in 2050. This trend is significant in rural areas. So in the Japanese context, transformation can also mean how to deal with this population decline. And depopulation will alter the state of ecosystems. For example, in forest, the poorly managed old growth forests are increasing. Previous studies concerned about the risk of disasters and low carbon sequestration capacity. And in the abundant farmland is transitioning to forest or remaining to be a grassland. This transition will promote the expansion of wildlife habitats such as deer or bears. So the change will cause a conflict between human and society and wildlife. And recently, renewable energy has been introduced into such marginal lands. This introduction requires careful consideration of ecological impact. So population decline is a key indirect driver of landscape change and a key constraint of social capital for management activity. And our case study site is Bekambeshi River Basin in northeastern Japan. About 70% of the watershed is a forest, and about the 20% is a grassland. And the primary industry is a major industry in this region. that is agriculture, pasture land for dairy farming, and forestry. And in this region, population decline is a serious problem too. By 2050, the population will be decreased to the half of the current level. So what we want to know is the consequence of social ecological systems if we transform our society. So first, we tried to explore the plausible future scenarios in shrinking society using scenarios and models. And then we have conducted a seeking approaches to design the transformation. In our PANCES project, first, we developed a national scale scenario narratives representing the plausible future conditions in Japan, as Dr. Saito described. The PANCES project scenario consisted of two axes. The vertical axis shows the people's preference of capitals, natural capitals. So whether natural capitals inside the region will be used, or people prefer the exported goods. And horizontal axis shows the distribution of residential population. So we translated these national scale narratives into the local landscape management scenarios. The vertical axis of PANCES scenarios was described self-sufficiency rate. So we translated it to how much we will manage forest or pasture land. And the population distribution was translated to where to maintain landscape management practices. And these quantitative scenario settings were input to spatially explicit simulation model to simulate the vegetation dynamics under each scenario and under each climate change scenarios. In our case study, we applied a widely used forest landscape model, LANDIS2, in combination with the local forest inventory database. And we used the model output to evaluate multiple ecosystem services or biodiversity. And our results showed biodiversity and ecosystem services respond to future scenarios. For example, the future population distribution affected the spatial arrangement of abundant pasture lands, which in turn affected landscape structure and biodiversity. And timber and pasture yield increased in the scenarios that utilize natural resources in the region. And in terms of the carbon sequestration service, the major carbon sink was deferred between the scenarios, but increased from the BAU scenario. So anyway, our results suggested that transformation in people's preference of local natural capitals to use and in the selection of residents in the future is a key for changing local nature and nature's contributions to people, even if in a shrinking society. And after we explored plausible futures, we tried to seek the pathway to achieve the transformation in terms of the decarbonization and biodiversity conservation at the same time. And after the Paris Agreement, there is a movement to convert increasing abundant farmland into the land for producing renewable energy for the decarbonization of local society. In our study areas, a solar PV system was already installed on some marginal lands or near wetlands. But as many researchers reported, such renewable energy installation will cause conflicts with local ecosystems depending on the type of renewable energy and site selection. But renewable energy installation for decarbonization and biodiversity conservation are both important. So we tried to answer the question, how to strike a balance between the decarbonization and biodiversity conservation. So we analyzed the 62 scenarios, and depending on how much pasture land would be abundant and used for renewable energy production, and which renewable energy type would be introduced. And first, I will show you the ecological impact and the energy supply of the case where only woody biomass is introduced into abundant pasture land. If we increase the abundant pasture land for woody biomass production, the broadleaf forest was increased and the ecological indicators were improved. On the other hand, as we were installing solar PV, a large amount of energy were expected to be supplied, but ecological indicators were reduced. So the results showed a clear trade-off between the renewable energy production and local biodiversity. And such kind of our results provided a scientific data for designing the best mixture of renewable energy. The horizontal and vertical axis shows the expected renewable energy production and biodiversity impacts. And there was a clear trade-off between the two axes, and we can learn a lot from the figure. If we mixture the medium solar PV and rewilding for biodiversity energy production, we can meet a balance between the demand and supply and can improve the biodiversity values. And if we utilized only woody biomass in the black cases, energy was lower than the local demand, but had the highest biodiversity values. So the transformation for decarbonization and biodiversity conservation requires the discussing future energy demand, which is highly related to their lifestyles and multiple SDGs indicators. And let me summarize my talk. Transition should be discussed interdisciplinary, as Dr. Roller says, and not only biodiversity or not only for climate change, but also like SDGs concept. So scenario analysis of transformation requires the incorporation of various indirect drivers in scenario narratives and the coupling of multiple models at local scales. So we expect the Nature Futures framework to provide the key direct drivers, indirect drivers, and the strategy to capture diverse values among stakeholders for such integrated scenarios and modeling. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Haga. We have only 2 minutes left of this session, so we have to proceed to the last speaker, Dr. Herlin Chien. Floor is yours now.
So my name is Herlin Chien. My case study is in Taiwan on urban river restorations. And so I try to see how my cases can be operationalized with this concept of Nature Future Framework. And in particular, my case might be more fit into the nature for society, since river restoration in Taiwan are mostly restored to increase the urban ecosystem services. And then my study time frame is from 2000 to 2020, so it's a retrospective study to look back 20 years of urban river governing and how that governance system impact the urban ecosystem services. And also, I'm looking at the human nature co-evolution scenario. So my challenge in this urban river system is not like in Japan, depopulation, but more in the problem of urbanization. And of course, this is not only happening in Taiwan, but also in many areas in Asia or in other parts of the world, where urbanization causes degradation of the ecosystem services, especially in the fresh water, such as urban river. So I conduct a literature review on how the urban rivers were governed. Most of the papers were taken from the environmental science perspective, and only about 6% of the paper are from the social science perspective. And I myself are from the political scientist perspective, and I'm trying to see how we can use a more socio-ecological system dynamic approach to evaluate this urban river governance fit problems. So I try to ask the questions, what is the socio-ecological fit or misfit that promote or impede the provisioning of the urban ecosystem services? And of course, the ecosystem service, including biodiversity of the urban river. And in my case, the river was restored by installing 3 man-made wetlands to purify the water, and of course, to increase the biodiversity in those urban rivers. I have 2 case study in 2 cities. They suffer from different problem of the urban river pollutions. This is the model I designed to try to collect data so that we can evaluate the governing institution and also the urban ecosystem services. In the governing section, I adopt a couple infrastructure system framework where I can quantify 5 different infrastructures: hard human-made infrastructure, soft human-made infrastructure, nature infrastructure, human and social, and then to see how this governing institution have an impact on the urban ecosystem services. These are some of my indicator. And then this is the 2 urban river comparison cases. The 2 river have a different number of man-made wetland to purify the rivers. This is an ideal scenario for a more balanced human nature. In my study, I try to investigate the different relationship between the resources users, as a citizen use the river for a particular purpose, and then between the resources system and then the public infrastructure, and then between public infrastructure and the public infrastructure provider, usually is the local government, and see how their human nature interaction or co-evolution dynamic in between it. So I have to speed up a little bit. So I quickly go to this table. As I mentioned, I have 20 years of data, and it's went through 4 different administration. Each administration is 4 years, 4 different mayors, and each mayor they have different investment in different infrastructure. So I want to see the variation in the investment of the infrastructure and how that impact on the outcome and performance of the urban river ecosystem services. In my study, I summarize there are 3 scenarios. The first scenario is a temporal misfit scenario, because each mayor, they only have 4 years of the term, and they invest X amount of money. But in fact, it takes much longer time to properly improve the water quality of this urban river. So we see this short-term versus long-term misfit, temporal misfit scenario. Secondly, we do see that the more infrastructure investment made by the local government, we see more urban ecosystem services are provided. However, they are more for the benefit of human, not for the benefit of nature. Lastly, we see as we invest more in the cultural services, usually we observe some trade-off between cultural services and provisioning services. Future solution to improve the human-nature relation, I propose 3 solutions. First one may be to build more social resilience. In the literature, it talk about how adaptive learning and then closer social resilience can resist sudden political or policy change, such as those government change. Secondly, we encourage a diversification of the infrastructure investment, so we can see more investment in social or human infrastructure. That's also helpful to restore the ecosystem. Lastly, during my data collection time, I see there's a lacking of the monitoring mechanism. So encourage not only the local government, but we want to promote citizen science monitoring and more long-term monitoring. So I, due to the shortage of the time, I conclude my presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are going to force to return to the plenary session in a second, but if we have some minutes, let me invite Professor Takeuchi for giving a few words for us to presentations.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to emphasize the importance of understanding the relationship between the people and nature. And in many cases in the developing country, people are too much pressure on the nature. But in the developed country like Japan or the EU, nature is existing, but because of the decreasing of the human pressure, the balance between the people and nature has been collapsing. And this is a kind of the issues on the in the secondary nature we call. And therefore, this problem can be interpreted as a harmonious coexistence between the people and nature. So either overuse or underuse are the problems. And so we need to consider these issues as one of the issues of the both sides of coins. So this is one thing. And the other thing is that we further need to consider that land use has been dynamic and has been always changing. And we need to consider how we could figure out the future of our relationship between the people and nature. For example, the case of Japan, we planted too many artificial plants on a higher elevation ground. And therefore, for example, we could recover the natural forest in such areas while trying to plant the trees on the abundant farm agricultural lands. So this is another opportunities for us to consider about how we could solve the social issues with the biodiversity issues. So this is another issues that I need to further develop. And lastly, I would like to emphasize the importance of combining the natural capital issues with the renewable energy development, because renewable energy is basically decentralized and is quite closely with the natural capitals like air, wind, solar, biomass, geothermal. These are the issues. And we need to consider how we could combine the renewable energy development with the revitalization of the local communities, particularly in the rural areas. And we could get a win-win situation. And one of the issues that we need to consider is who will the body to develop the renewable energy sources, or big capitals, or the local people. And I hope that if the local people try to combine the local activities with the renewable energy development, I believe that this will bring us an appropriate solution for combining of the various aspects, including the natural capital management and agriculture, forestry activities, as well as the renewable energy development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Takeuchi. I think we can return to the plenary.